I was very lucky that I got my dream by being posted on Chinook Fleet as a crewman on the side of a helicopter. Self-defense is anyone's inherent right to use appropriate force to defend themselves and their life. So we essentially had the right to press the trigger if we felt that our lives were absolutely threatened. And the bravest thing you can do as a parent is share your failures. Then your kids not only learn from them, but they also learn that failing is absolutely part of human society. Most of the time, humans want to help people. That is how we are as a human species. We want to fix people. We want to make them better.
Okie dokie. Good afternoon there. Liz McConaghy, thank you so much for joining me today on the Ridiculously Human podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Gareth. It's a pleasure to finally speak to you. It's been a couple of weeks in the making, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has actually. And it's funny because I was going to update the invite that we had for this chat because it was meant to be tomorrow at this time. And then you just dropped me in a message like 2 hours ago and you're like, can we do it this afternoon? And I'm like, oh, hang on. Yeah, okay, cool. Let's go for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's good to finally chat.
Yeah, because like sometimes you get it into your head where you're prepping for something, but you're like, okay, cool, I'm prepping for this, but it's tomorrow, so it's all good. And then it's like, oh, flip, it's going to be now. Like you go, yeah, okay, cool. But it's better having sporadic chats like this. So
Exactly.
Yeah. So I just wanted to start your story off because I think you're this incredible lady, and there's I know this chat can go so many different ways, and you could probably spend hours just talking about one thing with you, But you were 19 when you went to the Royal Air Force, okay? That's kind of unusual, and especially for a lady as well. What was it something that always interested you? Was your family in the military, in the Air Force, in the Navy? What was it?
So totally not that. It was my older brother, who's about 2 years older than me. I mean, we used to play army as kids in the woods in Northern Ireland, where I grew up. If you hadn't guessed from the accent by now, but we kind of had this idyllic childhood where you could disappear off in the morning and kind of go and take your little rucksacks and go and play soldiers. And he joined the army when he was 18, and I went with him when he did his entrance test. It's called the Barb test, and it's just an army entrance exam. And I saw this magazine, and on the front of this magazine, it had a guy hanging out the side of a helicopter. And I was just like, that is it. I want to do that job. It looked so rock and roll. So I basically asked the guys in uniforms up at this career office about it. And they kind of gave me the download of what I needed to do. So I had an interview back in Northern Ireland. I then came across to England and did aptitude tests, which is all your sort of reactionary tests and things like that, and your ability to remember numbers, and a little bit of piloting tests as well. Passed all that, passed a medical, and then was accepted on my 19th birthday to join. So I came across from, tiny little country bumpkin to suddenly being in the Air Force and marching up and down the square and learning how to fire a weapon and all those kind of things. So it was quite a steep learning curve straight away. And as you say, there weren't that many females in the military in total back then. This was actually a week after 9/11, so 2001. But there was still very few females in the military, but certainly in my particular branch and role as aircrew, there were only 3 of us on basic training, and then I was the only one who went to helicopters. So yeah, really in the minority, but always made to feel like one of the team. We were one team. We fail or succeed together was very much the thinking throughout my forces career, and I was quite lucky in that respect. I'm not sure if every female had that experience in the military, but certainly in the kind of environment I was in, it was great.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. Did you ever want to be something else? Or was that just a defining moment? Or how did it work?
Always just want to be the rock star in the magazine on the hang out the helicopter. And funny enough, it wasn't a Chinook helicopter on the magazine. I think it was a Sea King, which is the search and rescue helicopters. But whenever I'd gone for one of my first interviews, I basically parked my little car to get a car pass, and a Chinook helicopter came right over the top of me at 20 feet. And the Chinooks are very distinctive for anyone who doesn't know what they look like. They're the ones that are the big green flying buses with the rotor blade front and aft. So they're very distinctive in the sky. They're very loud. They're just huge, and they just sort of overwhelm you when you see them. So I just fell in love with it there and then, and that was all I ever wanted to fly on. So I was very lucky that I actually got my dream by being posted there, and then basically spent my entire career on Chinooks. But I always kind of joke it wouldn't have mattered if I'd had the aptitude to be the first Red Arrow pilot, which is our flying display team over here in the UK, because all I wanted to be was a crewman on the side of a helicopter. So I was very lucky. I think, as a young person these days, it's so rare that young people actually make it through those early formative years of university and whatever, and find their dream and get their dream job. And I was the luckiest person ever that I really did.
Did you ever read the book Chicken Hawk by any chance?
Yes, chicken hawk is like a rite of passage when you're going through our baby helicopter training. Everyone on the course had a copy of Chicken Hawk, and I still do. And actually, one of the biggest compliments I've ever got since my book came out was someone said, "Oh, it's the new version of Chicken Hawk," which is ridiculous to even compare the two, but it's nice that someone said it. But yeah, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, because actually it's funny. I was traveling last year, and one of the books that read was Chicken Hawk, and I was like, when we started, or when I started doing the kind of research on you for this podcast, I was like, man, I bet you know a lot of your kind of stories are almost similar to the ones you read in there, because that was like pretty captivating book, and yeah, I mean crazy
Yeah, very
stories.
much it struggles at the end of that, which again, whenever I read Chicken Hawk, I think I reread it many years later as well. I hadn't really, I was never going through any of my own struggles then. And it's interesting now to compare, I guess, my story with his story. Now, when I do look at them as books, I guess, because I very much struggled, and it's very well documented whenever I left the military a few years later. But I remember at the time, not really understanding that concept on that part of the book, really, or not necessarily couldn't understand, but had no empathy with.
Yeah.
Whereas now I do. Yeah, now I do.
Yeah, absolutely. So you then so you join at 19, right? Then 21 you go to Iraq, and like is that like during the war, or had the war kind of like sort of ended then? And what is like going through your head at 21 years old? You're this young lady, and now you're going to this like war zone. It's must be crazy.
I couldn't wait to go with the honest answer. When you join the military, I guess a lot of us join. Well, none of us really join for the money or the lifestyle. We kind of just join because there's something in us, like a seed to serve. And whenever you're going through all your training, you just can't wait to get to the front line and start to be able to do your job. And certainly that's what the Chinook Force were out in Iraq doing. They were after the war had finished, and that was when I went. The war fighting phase had finished, so a lot of it was sort of infrastructure, moving a lot of the troops and supplies around the theatre, and obviously covering that medical emergency response team. So that's like the medevac for the British troops that were out there. So I think I just couldn't wait to go, because I'd seen a lot of my colleagues on the squadron, come back with their tans and their desert combats on, which was different to the uniform that I was wearing. I was wearing my flying suit back in the UK, and I just couldn't wait to like put on the cool gear and get out there and then come back with some stories. So I was really excited. And I think, the two things that I always remember from Iraq were the heat. It was like next level off the chart heat for, again, a 21-year-old who came from Northern Ireland, but also everyone says, what was the scariest thing? And I always say the camel spiders. We had, I mean, you guys out there have got some, like, you've got a lot of wildlife that will try and kill you, but we don't really back here in England. And yeah, the camel spiders are off the chart. They're like the size of your hand, sometimes bigger, and they like to hide under the aircraft chocks, because that's a nice shaded area. So very often you'll be pulling the aircraft chocks out on a start, and one of these things will jump at you. So yeah, I remember camel spiders being probably the biggest thing that I was scared of.
Yeah,
But
I mean, just the name, like camel spider, makes you go, "Oh my gosh, what is this thing?"
look them up. Anyone that's listening, have a little Google. There are some really gnarly pictures out there of camel spiders.
Yeah, it's funny, like talking about like creatures and stuff. There's a guy that lives like not far from me here in South Africa, like, about 80 k's over the mountain. And yesterday he was cleaning out his dog's sort of bedding. And it's really cold here right now, right? And he pulled out this puff adder. And it was sleeping in the dog's like blankets, right? And he's like, "Oh, I found this little thing in the dog's blankets." And I mean, those things will pretty much kill you if they attack you. What other animals did you find out there, like in the deserts in Iraq?
There was a lot of scorpions. So actually, our engineers caught a camel spider and a scorpion, and they put them in a tank together, and kind of like for a big fight off. But every single time, the scorpion was winning, because they would just pierce the top of the camel spider. And so the engineers decided to design, they basically cut up a tin of Coke, and they made some armor for the camel spiders, and then glued some armor onto the back of the camel spiders. And then it was kind of more of an even fight. But it is amazing what bored squatties will do whenever you're away in a war zone. So yeah, there was very often this tank with these two animals having a go at each other inside it. But other than that, I mean, we were pretty much on the base, so it was just those kind of like little beasties that were running around, but we didn't see too much out in the Bondo or anything like that.
one of my friends, he's Swedish, and he also was out in Iraq. And I remember like talking to him, and he was telling me about the bases out there. And he was like, "Man," he's like, "Gareth, you won't believe how awesome these bases are. Like, especially the American ones. He's like, they are
Oh yeah.
massive. They have like literally everything you want." Crazy huge gyms, like all the food, like like they fast foods and stuff like that. And yeah, what was it like for you?
They really did, and certainly in Iraq, that was very apparent. There was a Pizza Hut. We were based out of Basra Air Base, which was predominantly a British air base, but there was a pocket of Americans there, so we had a Pizza Hut. We actually built our own bar, which is pretty cool. As Brits can be quite inventive when we need to be, so we built some pretty cool bars. You could go and have a couple of tins of beer after a day's tasking, which we actually didn't have in Afghanistan. We could have absolutely no alcohol at all out there. And I look back now and think, the importance of being able to decompress with your mates after a tough day and just chilling with a pizza and a beer. We didn't have that. And that's maybe where a lot of people have developed problems with PTSD and things, maybe going forward. But I think in terms of, having the Americans anywhere, like some of the big bases like Talil, which was in Iraq, was just off the chart. They had Green Bean Cafe, which is a coffee shop, Burger King, Pizza Hut, Subway, and you hear of like war is hell. And don't get me wrong, there are bits of war that are hell, but actually we're phenomenally good at making ourselves comfortable wherever we're going to go. And the Americans do that really well.
So what is it like? I mean, I can't even imagine it. So you have separate bases. You're like, okay, cool. This is the Americans. This is the Swedes. This is the British. Like, how does it work exactly?
Kind of all together in the same base a lot of the time, or there is a predominantly owned and run sort of nation that will look after a base, and then they will have sort of outposts of other troops there. A little bit like even here in the UK, we've got one very big American base here in the UK, and that's a bit of a foothold for the Americans to then launch some of their ops from here rather than having to base everything out of the US. So it was kind of the same concept really over there. You would have a few different nations would predominantly have their main base, but then they would have little pockets of us in and around there. So, but Kandahar, when we ended up in Afghan, was just off the chart. There was just basically a flight line where there was the Brits, the Dutch, the Aussies, the Americans, and it was like the whole line was just full of different nations. So, and it was good fun because if you made mates with them all, then you could go and have different. Everyone's got different cultures, haven't they? So you could go. I mean, the Dutch like to have chocolate sprinkles on their toast or their bread in the morning. You could go and have a chat with those crews and have some chocolate sprinkles. You'd go and see the Yanks and get some Gatorade and a lot of protein bars. At the Aussies, we'd always go and borrow some engines off them, and because they had loads of spares for Chinook helicopters. So yeah, it was quite fun actually working in that multinational environment.
Yeah, for sure. And like, do you have to pay for stuff? How does it work? Is everything kind of is supplied for you? Because I mean, it would make sense that that's the way.
Usually on swapsies, yeah. It's different obviously with like things like aircraft parts and whatnot, but a lot of the time, when you're in war, you just borrow stuff and sometime we'll get it back to them. But yeah, with things like that, like the Yanks, for example, loved our combats that we wore. They were really soft. They were like pajamas, and they used to always ask if they could swap a set of them for something. So you just go and swap things and like patches and badges and stuff like that. But no, it was just like being a big summer club, really. That was Iraq. Obviously, things got slightly tastier in Afghan over the years, and when we all moved to Camp Bastion, and then things really ramped up. But there was still always that real camaraderie and like that brotherhood with all the other nations. It was really good.
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, it sounds cool, but obviously, there's a whole other side to the story there. But the other interesting thing, like what you said, was almost like keeping yourself a bit busy, and the engineers were creating armor for the for the Scorpion or for the Spider. What other things did you kind of get up to on just to keep yourself busy? I guess like.
Well, I'm not much of a reader, and to be honest, it was so hot out there. Whenever you read a book, a lot of the pages would fall out at the end of the book because the glue would melt. It was really that hot.
What?
So yeah, so you always hoped it wasn't the last chapter or the last page that flew off in the wind. But and most of the time it was the gym. Really, a lot of people either were watching box sets on TV because we had TVs out there. The accommodation was pretty swept up, or just being at the gym a lot of the time. So a lot of people, we used to refer to it as fat camp. So you'd basically go on deployment for 3 months and you would do a lot of exercise, you get a bit of a tan, and you come back with an operational bonus, so a bit more money because you've been away. And yeah, you basically came back skinny, brown, and rich. It was great. Again, those are the early days. So I'm selling war like it was some kind of amazing thing and everyone should sign up. It really wasn't all that positive, but those were the early days for sure.
Yeah, I always think like the camaraderie is like such a amazing thing, you know, and like it must be hard to almost explain to people that are civilians like myself, you know, like how cool it was actually out on those bases. Yeah.
Yeah, when we were deployed, you know, you're living with people for, you know, 2 months at a time. You're all staying in the same tent together. You're going to the gym together. You're eating together. So you get to know everyone extremely well. And especially when you have a tough day, or you are maybe getting shot at and going through these extremely stressful scenarios, that's when you see people's true colors. And that's also when when that adrenaline releases from your body, you really kind of glue together as a team, and you decompress together as well. So I think you do build very solid, almost, you know, through adversity, forged in adversity, kind of friendships that will stand you for the rest of time, really.
And how did you find it, like as a lady, like, you know, probably surrounded by 98% men? Like, were they just like brothers? They like big brothers to you? Or what was it like?
Yeah, absolutely. They were just phenomenal. It was just like literally having loads of big brothers and uncles, and then some of them were like really old, so they were almost like father figures to me. And I think that's where I almost saw my career progress, because I started as everyone's little sister, and then I became everyone's like kind of auntie, and then by the end of my career, I was like people's mum because I'd been in for so long. So you know that kind of progression as well, and my own kind of, you know, advice and the time I'd done in the role and things like that was quite interesting to watch. But yeah, I think again, I alluded to it at the very start, you know, sometimes the forces can get a really bad rep for maybe being a sexist organization, or for people going through the mill a bit, especially females. But I had a really lucky career, and I look back and think why. And I genuinely think it's because I was always at my true authentic self. You know, I never tried to be anything else. I never tried to be tougher than the guys. I never tried to like lift heavy things just to prove a point. I never started drinking beer and watching rugby for the sake of it. I was just me. And I was quite girly out of work, and I just got on with the job in work. I shouldn't try and get that the wrong way around or anything like that. And I think, you know, all trust is built on team, or sorry, all teams are built on trust, right? So
Mm.
you have someone new in a team and you say, oh, you know, do you like football? And they go, oh, yeah, I love football. And you say, oh, okay, who's your favorite player? And I said something like Eric Cantona, who played like 25 years ago. It's very obvious, very early, that you're lying about something. And that small, tiny lie can then derail everything when it comes to trust. So I always said, you know, my advice to any other females going through was always just be your true, authentic self. And that's where the trust will be built, and that's where the teams will be built. So I was very lucky. And, you know, the Forces is a very equal employer. You know, there's no gender pay gap like you have in Civvy Street. There's no different rank structure for women or female or men. And we certainly don't get a different colored uniform. You know, it's not pink for the girls, blue for the boys. We're all in it together. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten when people criticize the military, because it is very inclusive in that respect.
Yeah. Did you learn a lot about, like, say, men while you were there that you didn't know previously?
Well, I was only again 19 whenever I joined. So I think, you know, I kind of just went into a very male environment very, very quickly. And I think that was kind of nice going through life, because I sort of because again, that trust was there. I have quite a different insight into the way men think about things. And I think coming out the other side of that, maybe I have always had a sort of weird empathy with men. I've watched a lot of guys go through some quite tough divorces, and I've seen, and also a lot of guys who have lost, you know, ownership of their kids or whatever. And I've seen how much that can break them mentally. So I almost have almost a bit more empathy with the male kind of world, maybe, than the female world. And I probably have more stuff in common to chat with them. I always used to find it really hard when I come back from a deployment and go to the hairdressers, for example, because you know, they'd ask what I do for a living, and I'd say, oh, I man a huge big weapon on the side of a Chinook, and I do this, and I've been to Iraq, and I've been to Afghanistan. And suddenly this woman who cuts hair didn't have anything to talk to me about. Whereas you chat to guys and they'll be like, oh yeah, especially South Africans, you guys love weapons. So, and I've got a couple of South African mates over here, and they just love to chat to me about guns all day. But it was a very unique world to be part of, I think. And I am quite pleased about that. I think not I'm not saying all men are simple creatures, but I think sometimes they overthink things less than women do, and they're maybe easier to understand because they just call it out and say a spade is a spade. So I yeah, I've really enjoyed working with men. They're not catty to work with in that respect or anything like that. But we had some great females. You know, there was 6 of us in the heyday and max capacity, and all of those girls, same as me, had gone through this like filter system of basic training, of their helicopter training, and then made it to the front line on Chinooks. And because of that, they were also really strong, resilient, like-minded thinking girls. And not that fussed about hair and makeup and fancy nails, which I have now. They just wanted to get on with the job. And I think that was, it was really good that we were all kind of a kin spirit.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's what you said there. Like, blokes are actually really simple at the end of the day, right? We're actually not smart enough to play like psychological games. Really, we will just say things as they are and call it as it is. And like, I guess maybe a lot of the time, say women don't necessarily understand that. They'll be like, "Oh, that's a little bit harsh," and you're like, "No, but that's just what we're saying," like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's nice to learn those things,
Yeah, I like it. It's kind of refreshing. I actually think there's a lot the female world could learn from the male world if more women kind of put themselves in that environment and just listened instead of. I think sometimes women can feel too attacked in those kind of environments, and they're always looking for the threat. And maybe that's a thing that's come out of social media where women can sometimes feel in a very threatened environment when they're surrounded by men, but honestly, all the guys I've ever met will just want to help you and want to open the door for you and want to fix your car for you or help you lift the weight off the barbell. They're not there to try and unhinge you and unpin you. They genuinely just want to help and they're nice guys. So I think, if women could go into those environments a little bit more often without their threat senses switched on, they'd probably learn a lot more, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's refreshing to hear that, because I think guys these days feel a little bit like attacked, and they're like, hang
Yeah.
on, we're not really that bad, you know what I mean?
No,
We're just these
exactly.
simple blokes that like to help and get things on. I mean, of course, there are some crazy bastards out there too, but we can't
But
judge
there's plenty of
everyone.
crazy women as well. Do not worry.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly that.
yeah,
Exactly that.
exactly. So what was the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan? And wait, maybe before we go there, can you just maybe tell me a little bit more about, like, say, the landscape? What is the landscape like in Iraq? Because I've heard in Afghanistan it's like lush, beautiful, sort of almost rainforesty type of mountainous beauty.
Yeah, and it really was. Iraq was the complete polar opposite. Iraq was just desert, flat, plain desert with oil fields dotted around, and you could spot the oil fields obviously because it was like big pipes with the fuel being burnt on the top of the gas being burnt off at the top. But it was just barren, a lot of it. You would have the odd kind of lake, which was very leafy and green, and you could smell those for miles actually because of the kind of slightly tropical smell that came off the water. But other than that, it was just pure desert and it was very bland. It was all the same color. And it was exactly stark contrast to Afghanistan, which was just that, you had different colored desert areas. There was a thing between Kandahar and Camp Bastion, which is where we were mainly based for the majority of Afghanistan. And it was called the Red Desert. And the Red Desert was about a 45-minute flying time of just pure red, deep red sand. And it looked like if you pour icing on a cake, when it kind of comes to a stop, the colors will change very dramatically. It was like that. It didn't kind of fade out. It literally just looked like someone had poured a big lump of red sand on the earth. So that was really special. And the sand dunes there were incredible. And every so often you'd be flying over it. And you would have been flying for 20 minutes, half an hour, and seen nothing. And then you'd see a Bedouin camp, or you'd see one man walking, one Afghan local walking, and you'd think like, where have you come from and where are you going to? Like, they are a hardy nation. They are just incredibly resilient and tenacious. But even further up the Helmand Valley, then you had a thing called the Green Zone, which ran the whole way up the Helmand Valley. And that was the lush green area, which basically was either side of the Helmand River, which kind of fed all the kind of water into all the lush kind of poppy fields and stuff as they were growing their crops. But then beside that, mountain after mountain after mountain, there was a big ridge of mountains that ran all the way up the Helmand Valley. And then, of course, up like further north in Afghanistan, you've got the Hindu Kush and things like that. So it's a stunning country. And I often think it's so sad that it's so war torn even now that we've left and it's kind of fallen back to the Taliban, that it can't be a tourist place because it is so beautiful and it'd be so worth people seeing. And I've been very privileged to see it from the air as well, unlike a lot of the squaddies who are out there on the ground. But I also think that that's maybe its beauty because it hasn't been touched by Western tourism and there isn't a Disney park there and that kind of thing. So yeah, but it's stunning.
Yeah. Do you ever like think back on, like, say, I guess what you've done and go, wow, I've actually been quite privileged in terms of how I've seen the world. Like you just touched on now, you were flying above the world for so much of your career and like seeing it literally from a bird's eye perspective. Have you ever thought, wow, my reality is so different to many, many people? just based on
Yeah,
that alone.
I am very lucky. And I remember for years thinking, I wish I had the superpower of to be able to click my eyes and like snapshot, blink and snapshot that moment for my mum to see. Because my mum loves looking at things in the air and she's always been fascinated with like Google Earth and things like that. And I thought there's so many things I've seen from the air, the perspective's completely different, and it would be so nice to have catalogued all. And a lot of the time you didn't fly around with a camera, A, because you were doing your job, but B, even if Afghanistan, we weren't allowed to take our phones with us or anything like that. So very often, we didn't have the method to take a lot of those pictures. But I think you do. I've lived a very privileged life seeing, not just countries like Afghanistan from the air. And, again, a lot of people who did tours out in Afghanistan, they were basically taken by a helicopter most of the time or by road. They were put in their forward operating base. They did their 6 month tour and then they went home. So they saw but they also got to then see the ground kind of kinetics and meet the locals and eat local food potentially and things like that. We didn't. We just saw it from the air, but the air was incredible. Seeing things from the air was incredible. But I've also been flying in Morocco where we got to fly over the Atlas Mountains. And I've also been through the London heli lanes multiple times and been to San Diego and flown through San Diego heli lanes and over Miramar Air Base, which is where Top Gun was filmed. And that was a very surreal moment flying over there in our Chinook helicopter. And they had more aircraft based there that we could see from the air than the entire Air Force put together. So it's been a very privileged life in that respect. And I think even closer to home, you realize how beautiful your own country is. England is a really lush place to live, and Wales and Scotland, and I've got to see them all from the air and all the coastlines and those funny little things that other people wouldn't have got to see.
Yeah, I always think like the world is like so beautiful, and we're always looking at like say, oh, this country is so beautiful and that country is so beautiful, but actually all of our countries are so beautiful, and we kind of like forget that because we don't often.
Appreciate it.
But we also don't often travel our own countries, right? Like most people, if you think about, say, the UK, oh yeah, I'm going on holiday to Spain this summer, or I'm going to
Yeah.
whatever island, whatever, and you don't really travel your own country a lot of the time, which is also kind of strange.
I totally agree. And I think that's one thing, maybe lockdown. Lockdown, there was so many bad things. There was also so many good things to come out of it. And that was one of the things, maybe a lot of people stayed closer to home for a few years after lockdown and kind of explored England a bit more and Scotland and Wales around here. So, but you're right, you don't generally ever go and explore your own back door and appreciate it, I think. And yeah, we're quite lucky. I like the fact that we have 4 seasons here in the UK as well. So it always looks different depending on what time of year you're looking at it. But yeah, we are very lucky.
Yeah, for sure. So Afghanistan was like quite a different beast by the sounds of it, and I guess it's shaped you in different ways, and also, I guess you suffered a bit of trauma, PTSD, etc., as a result of what you saw and did and everything like that. So that was more like actually this is war, and we're now here to rescue people, save people, and yeah, maybe you can just tell me a little bit like what that was like.
Yeah, and actually, in the early days in Afghanistan, it was very similar to Iraq. We were based out of a big air base, Kandahar. We had a boardwalk there, which had Burger King, the Pizza Hut, all the stuff from Iraq was there. We even had a Starbucks. It was amazing. So, it didn't really feel like war. And Camp Bastion, which then became the big British base, didn't exist. So, early days, a lot of the Chinook force was helping move all the building equipment and all the construction equipment across that red desert I spoke of to build Camp Bastion. And then obviously Camp Bastion was finished and a lot of British troops got inserted into Afghanistan, into the Helmand Valley. And then there was these forward operating bases, which are these little outposts of troops the whole way up the Helmand Valley. And it was basically the Helmand Valley specifically was the British sort of controlled area, or where the British were then patrolling to kind of bring peace to the area. And we watched Camp Bastion grow out of the ground. It was insane. It was huge by the end of it. But it stands to reason the more boots you put in the ground, the more vehicles are driving around, the more IDs are going to go over, the more bullets are going to fly, and things got kinetic very, very quickly. And we noticed it as a force, I think, initially, because we were getting shot at every single day. We'd gone from the odd pot shot, maybe being shot at once or twice a week with small arms, to then in that sort of the heyday, as I call it, but like sort of 2008 onwards, being shot at, rocketed, mortared, RPG'd nearly every single day. And every time we came into landing sites, we'd have 30 seconds on the ground before incoming was you heading your way. So you had to like basically touch and go and get off there as fast as possible. So it certainly sharpened the senses, but it also made you phenomenally good at your job, because as soon as you landed, you had to be absolutely on it in terms of getting vehicles out, getting troops loaded, being able to communicate with people effectively at the ramp, so you get the right people on, the right people off, that kind of thing. And every single day was different. You put the ramp down, and sometimes you were expecting like to pick up a motorbike or a quad bike and trailer, and the next thing you've got two big Land Rovers waiting to come on, and you're like, right, I've just got to get this done and really be on your game. So so it was quite intense, but it was it's like anything. If you're going to be a footballer, you want to be in the Premiership. If you're going to be in the forces, you want to be doing your job. And I think that's why I was really lucky to be on the Chinook helicopter, because it's the biggest shop floor, as we call it, of any helicopter. You can fit more inside and more underneath than any other helicopter. So you really learnt your trade, and it was just a phenomenal beast in terms of what it could carry. So I quite enjoyed some of the mental arithmetic that went with that.
Yeah, but you're like sort of multi-talented / multitasking by the sounds of it. I don't know, I'm just making this up, but you can tell me what really am. But like, so you've got your gun, not a gun, but your
No, it really was a gun, yeah. So we got basically the pilots. For anyone who kind of doesn't know how it all works in the helicopter, we've got two pilots at the front, and they're the glorified taxi drivers, which we always remind them of.
I'm sure they love that.
They do. They love when I tell them that. But they get us from A to B, and obviously, they do have a lot of skill, especially to land in a dust cloud in Afghanistan or to hover over one of those underslung loads. But the reality is, when we get there, there's a job to be done. And so that's where the crewman will come in. We will do all the internal loading. We'll make sure the aircraft is overhead any of those underslung loads that we pick up by voice marshalling the pilot forward and back, left and right. Because he can't see. Obviously, he's stuck at the very front and he has no idea. And he also doesn't know what obstacles are behind them, and when the discs are clear of like sangers or trees when you're coming into landing site. So we will talk the aircraft onto the ground for him. But we're in charge of the navigation now. We've got moving maps down the back. We do a lot of the radios, and especially out in Afghanistan, we were in charge of the TAC radio, which was the radio that would be speaking to a lot of the troops on the ground. And then sometimes we would also speak to the other airborne assets like the Apaches and things like that, while the pilots would stay with air traffic control. So they would have like the big safety picture, and we would sort of talk on the nitty gritty side of things. So you're doing the radios, you're doing the navigation, you're doing everything that comes inside. And then, of course, you've got those weapons that you mentioned. So we had a weapon called the M60 fitted in Iraq, which was actually the weapon you would have seen in a lot of the Vietnam War films that were bungeed on the side of the Hueys. And it fires a round. It's actually 200 rounds in 2 minutes. So essentially 100 rounds a minute. And the minigun, which we fitted to the weapon or to the aircraft in Afghanistan, fires 3,000 rounds a minute.
What?
Which is a lot. Yeah. So like a huge step up in firepower. And, even when we went to Afghanistan, I thought, well, we're not fitting those for no reason. I knew Afghanistan was going to be a very step up in terms of threat. And having those weapons fitted was one of the big giveaways. But 3,000 rounds a minute's insane. And because we had 4-ball 1 tracer in our sort of belt setup for the rounds that we carry, at 7.62 rounds, whenever you do fire it at nighttime, it was like a lightsaber. It was just, these bullets coming out the end. But it was such a great weapon that a lot of the time it was even a deterrent to the Taliban. Very often they wouldn't even try and take a pot shot at us, because they knew that if we returned fire, they would just be gone straight away. So it did play in our favor, just having that weapon fitted to the aircraft, for sure.
So you don't you're going into land and you're not shooting at the same time unless you have to, right? I mean, is that how? Yeah. What, just to save ammunition or other reasons?
No, there's very strict rules of engagement. So the rules of engagement, certainly in the early days in Afghan, were I think called Card Alpha, which is self-defense. And it's the same as you have right now. Self-defense is that anyone's inherent right to use appropriate force to defend themselves and their life. So we essentially had the right to open up, pull the trigger. It's actually not a pull trigger. It's a tiny little press, and it's about the size of your thumbnail. But to press the trigger if we felt that our lives were absolutely threatened. And obviously we had a whole aircraft full of troops on board. So you very much had to make that call in time to defend the aircraft. Now, at one sort of stage in Afghanistan, things ramped up a little bit, and we changed to a slightly different rule of engagement, which was a 49 Alpha. And essentially what that meant was that anyone who was suspected Taliban, so anyone wearing a black turban north of Highway 1, which was the main road that ran west to east, was expected to be Taliban. So we could, within our rights, open up on those. guys, but you know, I very much have been of the thought process in my career that you cannot put the bullet back in the barrel. Once you press that switch, you know, you have to live the consequences for the rest of your life. So you have to be extremely sure that you know who you're shooting at is a legitimate target. So I was always, and it's hard because you can't say you're erring on the side of caution, because you can't be cautious. You know, ultimately, if you pause and an RPG hits the back of the aircraft, then it's on you as well. But I wasn't gun happy. There was other people, certainly a lot of the American crews, who would just, like you say, hose stuff down, or they'd fly into landing sites and put warning shots down as they were coming in. And that's all fine, providing that you absolutely know what you're shooting at. But there was too many near misses and too many things called blue on blues, which is where own forces troops hit each other, and with the worst outcome. So yeah, I always very much was like, I will know. And I always used to use the saying, if it's him or me, it's him. And as long as I get to that point in my head, then I know it's time to pull the trigger.
Wow, so that's fascinating. Even in war, you have these rules of engagement. Like, okay, yeah, you can't shoot because we're coming in to save somebody or pick something up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost hard to sort of comprehend as like for someone like myself, you know, because it just feels like
Yeah.
guys want to just go all
It's
out.
not like a Hollywood movie. You don't just hose baddies down because they're standing there. You know,
Yeah.
you can put warning shots down, and we got sanctioned a lot of the time to put warning shots down, but it was in a clear area. It was an area that was known to be clear of compounds, because you also don't know if there's a family in there with a baby or anything like that. So you couldn't just hose stuff down. War is very different in reality to what you see in Hollywood movies. And it's also 90% of the time really dull and really boring, with 10% of high octane. And I think that could be any of the ground troops will probably say the same. You know, you're sitting around sometimes for a whole like a day, and you have like a 20-minute contact, and which is where someone's shooting at you, and suddenly your adrenaline spikes, and you know it's off this chart in terms of, you know, all your senses are switched on, your fight or flight response is switched on. And then it finishes, and you go back to watching a box set or sunbathing or reading a book. And those spikes in that kind of adrenaline can actually be really dangerous going forward, you know, later life whenever you leave the military. But also in the background, you've got a constant sense of fight or flight switched on. You know, we as military people, whether or not you ever deploy to war, from the very first day you put the uniform on and you stand in parade square, you're taught to not flinch when someone screams in your face, and you're taught to shoot a weapon on a range and not recoil in fear. So we're overcoming our fight or flight response, which is, you know, lion comes into the room, everyone runs out. That's normal behavior. We are taught from the off to overcome that normal behavior and go to the fight. So if you have that switched on constantly for a very long time, it can actually be really, really difficult to switch it off when you either leave that environment or leave the military. And I think that's where a lot of people then struggle afterwards, because they've essentially normalized that heightened response sense. So they can either become very desensitized to normal life. You know, they don't sweat the small stuff, is always the saying. But the truth is, you know, when your wife or your kids are really stressed about something and you have zero empathy for that because your normality bar is way up here, that can make it very difficult to maintain connections with people or to build relationships. So it absolutely can have a detrimental effect on people. And especially with things like PTSD, if you've normalized trauma and normalized danger your whole life, it can certainly take its toll on you. And that's what, not just the forces, but all blue light services. You know, we have the NHS here, but you guys obviously have a healthcare system too. You have ambulances, firefighters, even care workers, all those people that are in those kind of roles where they see trauma very regularly and they see danger regularly, they absolutely normalize it. And you know, it's usually the dark sense of humor that gets them through. But what happens when that stops?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not something like, you know, like I guess normal civilians even think about. They don't have to worry about that sort of assimilation back into regular society. How have you found, like, say, dealing with people, like since you've kind of left? You know, and also like say stressful situations. Do you get like maybe annoyed with people if they get like worried about a situation? You're like, what are you worrying about? Like you're ridiculous.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think the biggest indicator was after you'd come back from a deployment. So you'd be away for 3 months in these kind of very stressful scenarios. and you'd come back and find that your kind of like patience for people was really short. And I always used to laugh that I would go to like the supermarket and people would stop their trolleys in front of me and I'd literally want to rip their heads off. Or I would get to the top of an escalator and someone would stop at the top of an escalator and not move, and you're like, get out of the way. And you had this, if your anger switch came on really, really quickly. So that was kind of like a very low level indicator. But yeah, I found it quite, quite difficult when people were, I kind of like, I always recall this story. I went in a hen do one time after I'd been away on one of my deployments, which was pretty kinetic actually. And I came back, and 2 or 3 days later, I was at this hen do in a place called Liverpool here in the UK, which is a big party capital. And a couple of my friends from Northern Ireland had come over for it. And one of the girls was in tears the first morning. And I said, what's happened? And she'd forgotten her hair straighteners. And 3 days earlier, I'd been picking up guys with no legs, and it's all. But as my mate sort of explained to me, he was a policewoman at the time, and she said, "But Liz, it's all about perspective. In her world, that is huge. In your world, that is so small, it's nothing. But once you can take yourself out of that emotional kind of side of judging people, and have the slightly wider situational awareness to understand that, then it gives you a lot more." Again, not empathy, but maybe sympathy for people. And I think that's important for us all as a human race to understand that everyone's world is different and how they view it through their eyes. And that can come from the things they've been exposed to as people as they grow up, or their childhood, or what the current environment. But everyone's stressors will be different. Everyone's been through different things and had different things that will have built their armor up for different scenarios, but you just need to understand that everyone is going through something behind closed doors. So I think as a human race, we could learn to be a lot less judgy sometimes and a bit more empathetic.
Yeah, no, 100%. A friend of mine, he always says, we're all living different realities. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's so true, like the life you've lived is like completely different to say the life I've lived. And the life I've lived is even completely different to say the life my wife has lived.
Yeah.
So how we interpret things, how we see things, how we react to things is like all different. So yeah, like you said, I mean, the more we can sort of just take a step back in situations and go, okay, cool, this is not me, this is like them. They are, they're just different to me, and that's cool. But I guess it's not always easy as well.
No, no, absolutely not. And again, I think the one thing my divorce maybe taught me, which is something we could all do be better at, is that everyone's perception of the truth is different as well. And I think you can be in a room and someone can go, it's really warm in here, and someone be like, oh my goodness, it's freezing. And you're both sat in the same room. It's the temperature has not changed, but it's your perception. The same with bright. Someone can say, oh, this is really bright in here, and someone's like, I think it's quite dark. It's about perception, and everyone's perception of things are different. And the sooner, again, you can understand that everyone's perception of their own truth and reality is different, then it gives us a lot more capacity as human beings, I think.
What was it like for you to have a relationship? Like you said, you were married. Was that with a guy that was also in the forces, or was that like a guy who wasn't?
No, it was. So I met my partner in Iraq in 2003, and he was special forces. So he was in our SAS, which is our special forces branch here. And so he was at like the very pointy end of his spear in terms of career. And I was a Chinook crewman, I was a door gunner, for what is the other term we got called. So we were like rock stars at barbecues. It was like we like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, that movie with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie in it. We were like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But and it was kind of good because we both had a huge kind of understanding of each other's career. And that was fantastic until we eventually got married later on in our relationship, and the marriage sadly only lasted for 2 years because we both came out of the military at the same time. And anyone I think who has served, whether or not I say it's forces or wearing a uniform for your whole life, and I mean that can even come to someone who's worked for a specific company your whole life, that becomes your identity. And when you lose that uniform, you can feel very invisible. You may have lost your purpose in life and you're searching for your purpose. And I think both of us left at the same time. And we were really struggling for that purpose, that identity. We didn't know who we were anymore without the uniform. And we started to fight each other. And again, coming back to the Mr. and Mrs. Smith thing, I always joke that our house was like the scene from Mr. and Mrs. Smith where they're trying to blow each other up, because it really was pretty bad at one point. So it was probably a good thing we got divorced. Otherwise, I'd be buried under the astroturf. But I kind of joke. But but I think again, what I realized many years later is that the uniform doesn't define you. You define the uniform. Ultimately, it's just a uniform on a shelf. until you put it on. And you're the person who breathes life, the soul, the personality, the banter into that particular uniform. And we're all very different. And that's what makes the forces or any company or sort of collective so strong, because of all the different people, but all wearing the same uniform that unites them. But you define the uniform, not the other way around. And that's where a lot of people, when they leave, they struggle because they just can't get their head around that. But you're the same person inside, and you can use that same you, the same fibers, the same personality to breathe the life into your next chapter, your next role, or whatever it is going forward.
I almost think you need like almost a few years, right? 3-4 years is in like a transition phase from like, you know, like you going, you know, say from the military into civilian life, or people going from being professional sportsmen into just being a normal person, even just like changing careers, like going from working for a corporate to working for yourself. Like these are huge like transitions, which are never as smooth as you might think they might go. And there's always like certain hiccups along the way. And you can get lost very easily because, like I said, you had everything, you knew how everything worked, et cetera, et cetera. But then, like now, you start figuring things out again in this whole new world, and you kind of need to give yourself a little bit of grace for those transitions. And it's not just a little, like I said, it's like probably a few years to eventually get onto the straight and narrow again.
And I think you're right. I think what you just hit on there, which was really important, was sports people, because a lot of sports people really struggle when they leave a team, or they're at the top of their performance in their own specific sport, because you've worn your name on the back of your shirt your whole life, and then suddenly you take the shirt off. Now, your name hasn't suddenly disappeared or changed, but you're just not wearing it for the rest of the world to see. And I think that a lot of them can really struggle with the same kind of that feeling of invisibility or lack of purpose because you're not part of the big machine anymore. But you are so right about needing a few years to kind of settle into Civvy Street. And the statistics are most veterans will have 7 jobs in 3 years, I think is the current statistic, whilst they basically find their next niche. And it's because, the forces kind of like bang us into a certain shape. They mallet us and they change us and they make us a product that they want. And we all become very, very similar in our way of thinking, not quite robotic, but we do become a product of your training, your basic training, and all the other specialized training you do. And then when you come out of that and you're trying to find something completely different, it can be, it's the old square peg, round hole analogy. It can be very hard to then find where you as the square peg fits. But if I think if we had more guidance when we leave, we have resettlement training, which is great. I know a lot of the blue light services, certainly the police here, don't have anything like that. You could serve in the police here for like 46 years and then hand your uniform in and they don't give you anything. I don't know what it's like over in South Africa, but we at least get a little bit of resettlement training. But I don't think anyone gives you enough guidance to say, don't rush it and don't be dismayed when you leave your first job after 3 months, or you hate your first job 6 months in and it's not for you, and then you feel like it's you and you're letting yourself down. Because if you can understand that concept, you're going to have to dip your toe in a few different ponds to find the right place for you to swim again. Then you'll be much happier, I think. So and probably less stressed. So you're completely right, it takes a while to find your purpose again.
Yeah. What was your first job after leaving?
So funny enough, I worked for a disabled flying charity, which one of their roles was to get, my particular role there was to get scholarships for disabled veterans to learn how to fly. So I was really lucky. I still had that purpose. I was still very much connected with the military, and a lot of those guys and girls that we picked up in Afghanistan who'd been injured were then going through my scholarship program and learning how to fly, and not just kind of go on a jolly in an airplane for an hour, but actually physically get their flying wings. So that was really good. And I also then did that for a while and went back to work at my old base and I was doing a simulator job there because I couldn't let go. I was, still clinging to the cliff face, not wanting to kind of let go of that place where I'd worked for 17 years. And I think I went back not wearing the uniform as a civilian, and the whole place felt very different. And I felt like I was kind of outside the building, like outside the greenhouse looking in, and everyone else was still inside the greenhouse. And I felt very much outside the club, even though I was still walking on the station. So I think that for me was quite a big lesson of like, you've just got to let go. And I think for so many people, again, you just cling to what's familiar and you end up leaving the military and going into a very similar job without trusting your wings and just jumping off the cliff and seeing where life takes you. And obviously then life took me on a very diverse journey, and wrote the book, and now I am a motivational speaker, and I stand on stage and do podcasts and things, which I never thought going back 6-7 years ago when I left the military I would ever be doing for a job. So but there's been a huge element of fear and kind of just trusting the process as that's happened.
Have you always been a confident person?
I guess it depends on the scenario. I would say I was fairly confident within my own role at work, and I'd done it for quite a long time. I became an instructor. I was a gunny instructor and things like that. So I'd worked my way up through the ranks quite well. So I was always confident, but I suffer from imposter syndrome loads. And people often ask, what is the difference? Because surely imposter syndrome is a lack of confidence, and it's not. Imposter syndrome, for anyone who doesn't know, is very much a lack in self-belief of your ability, and waiting to be found out, I guess, is another good way to summarize it. So I think I sort of suffered from that as I went through my career and got higher up in the promotion ladder. And again, because I was female, I was just always trying to be top of my game, because I was so ready for someone to go, oh no, she is the little blonde girl who has no idea what she's on about. So I made a point of almost overperforming in not just my work sort of side of things, but in terms of running. I did Ironman triathlons and all sorts of things like that to try and be as fit. I never wanted to outrun any of the lads, but I thought I didn't want to be the weak link here because I am female. So I always was on top of my game for that stuff. And it all was fueled by that imposter syndrome. And now, I very often I've done gigs here on speaking sort of stages, and ironically, I used to hate speaking in public when I was in the military. I used to hate standing up front of the squadron, even though it was all my mates. But now I speak in front of audiences that are like 800 people, and I'm confident in what I'm talking about because it's my story. I don't really suffer from nerves because I kind of know my story inside out, and there's nothing they can ask me that I won't know the answer to, in theory. But I still suffer this imposter syndrome really badly. And, a couple of examples: last year I was booked for a talk in January and got a standing ovation. And then I was booked again by the same company in the June, and went back and sort of sat at the back of the room waiting to go on, going, I really don't know why they've booked me again. Who's really interested in my story, blah, blah, blah. And sort of was like really talking myself down. And the only way to combat imposter syndrome really is to factualize it out. So you've almost got to go, hang on a minute, Liz. They have booked you for a second time. So they already know what you're going to talk about, and they've rebooked you. You got a standing ovation last time. That is a fact. And those are things, that's the only way to undo imposter syndrome. You've got to literally take a breath and pull out the facts and kind of undo the negative voice. So, but it's not easy, and I still suffer really badly.
Yeah, for sure. I always think like our mind is our strongest and weakest thing that we have, like you can do anything if you put your mind to it, but you can also like talk yourself out of anything too and believe that you're not good enough, and it's just a matter of kind of sometimes which voice you want to listen to.
Absolutely. I've done, like I said a minute ago, I did Ironman triathlons for a while, and we train and train and train for them, but there's no two ways about it. In any endurance event like that, if your head's not in the right place, you're never going to get to the end. And your brain is absolutely your strongest muscle in your body. And even now, I've done a bit more endurance running now here in the UK recently. And, I sometimes can set off on an 18-mile run, and you get to 5 miles and you're like, either head's not in the game, or a small little niggle will start to really amplify in pain level, where it's the same injury that you might not feel the next day or you might not feel the day before. But because your brain is not in a strong position, the pain level grows significantly because it's all you're focusing on. So I do think there's a lot of sort of science behind, having that really positive mental sort of outlook on life and being able to shrink the pain and the fear rather than letting it grow and grow. Because ultimately, the more things you focus on, the more things you focus on, that's what your brain is listening to, that internal monologue. So if you stop thinking about the pain, then it eventually does shrink and go away.
I also think that most people don't really push themselves enough in life, like especially physically, right? I think physical, like activity, physical endurance, like it can change your outlook on life and definitely your sort of mindset. Like you said, to say you're running a marathon and you get a cramp, like in, I don't know, kilometer 13, you got like another 29 to go. You can just like sort of go, okay, well, that's me done. or if you really know how strong your body is, because your body is really tough, right? But it's the mind that's telling you, no, 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 I must stop, I must stop, I must stop. But if you can just go, no, hang on, I'm just going to carry on, I'm going to carry on, then you start realizing actually, how this all works. And a lot of it is a mind game. But I do think you have to push yourself physically to kind of learn that lesson. That's been my experience, at
Absolutely.
least.
Totally agree. And it's like the saying, get comfortable being uncomfortable, because you realize that this does hurt, but it's not going to kill you. And your body is absolutely capable of incredible things. And I think the more you expose yourself to those uncomfortable feelings in a physical capacity, then the more, when life does challenge us, whether or not it's a life event or if it's like something to do with your family or a tough time at work, you suddenly have this inner confidence going, but I can do tough things and I can do them well, because you've pushed yourself through that kind of uncomfortable feeling. And, case in point, when I did the London Marathon this year, I'd already done like 22, 23 mile runs. And then on the day, I got a stitch in the first mile. And I was like, oh my God, Liz, you've trained for 6 months and you have a stitch in the first mile. But I was able to mentally go, it is just a stitch and your body is working. This stitch is a mental thing. And it's probably down to nerves or having been stood around for 2 hours waiting to run. But it hurt, but I just kept running and running and running. And people say, well, I can never outrun a stitch. Everyone can outrun a stitch. Your leg is not falling off. Your body is not falling apart. It's a mental thing. Everyone can outrun a stitch. So yeah, I managed to outrun it and finish the next 25 miles, thankfully. But it is all about that, just knowing that our bodies are incredible, and our minds are the strongest part of it.
Yeah. And I can imagine when you were like, say, in Afghanistan, it sounded like a lot of the time, well, all of the time, you're basically on call, right? So if you're fast asleep and it's 3 a.m., and that bell goes or whatever it is, telephone call, you've got to go, right? So you must have learned to like an absolute ton of resilience, and had this huge mental sort of capacity to handle pressure and stuff from your experience there.
Yeah, it's funny. I never really sort of look at it like that. I never think I was kind of any superhuman individual. We were all doing the same thing. And I think the line, we all had a job to do, is pretty much what drives you on, because somebody needs you more than your fear can stop you from doing it. And I was told very early on in my career by one of my instructors that it's all about or the lowest common denominator. So that troop bleeding out in the ditch on the battlefield, he needs you. And that stayed with me forever. They either need you to go and rescue them, or they need you to give them a lift home out of the Bondi, and get them back somewhere safely. And that always, that sense of purpose always stayed with me, is that there's somebody, and ironically with that, can be someone way further down the food chain that needs you the most. So you've got to step up for them. All too often I think we look upwards and we think we have to step up for the people above us, but we don't. I think we have to step up for the people below us. And I think that comes in a social responsibility. But I think it becomes, very obvious in a family responsibility. We have to set the example for children behind us, and, that younger generation. I certainly try to do it now with mental health and all the openness that I speak about my mental health. But because I'm not a parent, but I always encourage parents when I do my talk. I always say the bravest thing you can do as a parent is show your vulnerability to your kids, because then they will learn that it's okay to be vulnerable. Share your failures, because it's okay. If you share your failures, then your kids not only learn from them, but they also learn that failing is absolutely part of human society, and you will learn more from failure than you ever will from success. But all too often people are walking around like they're kind of infallible, like they're robots and they're superhuman, and no one's going to learn anything. Then that's where we as a human race will fail. We have to absolutely be open about our failures going forward.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, like the more you talk about that, like with whoever it is, your kids or friends or whoever, like then they then see you as human, and it also they then go, oh well, me too, and they're
Yeah,
like, okay, cool. Well, it's actually okay to talk about this, or to kind of admit I'm like, struggling a little bit here. So I always think that like vulnerability is actually kind of like some sort of superpower
I
that
agree.
gives other people permission to kind of almost feel good about themselves and go, okay, we're all going through this. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And one of the things I always say during my corporate talks here in the UK is that as a boss of a company, the most refreshing and actually empowering thing you can do as the boss is go in on a Monday morning and say, get your team together and saying, right, guys, I'm really struggling this week. I'm going through a divorce at home, or my mum's not well or whatever, and just admit I was saying about giving for people to give their mental health a number out of 0 to 10, and if a boss was to stand on the stage and say, guys, I'm a 4 this week, not only has he humanized himself, he's now made being vulnerable and having weakness normal for other people to then admit the same, but he's suddenly empowered all of the room to go, right, we're going to step up. We're with you, boss. We've got your 6. We're right behind you. And that builds a team. That's what team cohesion is about. You see it so often, and like, any rowing teams and things like that, any team that if someone's carrying an injury, everyone rallies around them. That was something I learned very early on in the military. Like, we don't cut off the weak person, we rally around and carry them with us. And I think for a boss or a CEO to stand in front of a room, or a parent sit around a dinner table with their kids and say, I'm really struggling this week, then suddenly you empower all the other people, and then you're all in it together, and they basically will want to help you. So, because that's human nature, most of the time humans, by their biology, they want to help people. That is how we are as a human species. And we want to fix people, we want to make them better. So show your vulnerability, don't suffer in silence.
One of my friends, a guy called Rich Mulholland, he has a great philosophy, I guess, on how we could maybe help people that are depressed. So instead of like, say your mate is down, like you're like, hey man, I'm here for you, like, let's go out, or if just call me if you've got an issue, because they're not, right? So they're not going to call you, but he says you should ask that person for help. He's like,
exactly
you should,
what I say. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, you should, like say, listen, can you, whatever it is, can you help me come fix my tire on my car, or whatever the story is, or I'm struggling with this, like myself, say my relationship, can you just help me? And he's like, because exactly what you were saying, like humans love to help. So if you all of a sudden take their own attention away from almost themselves to going, oh wait, I can help my friend here. It's a weird kind of way to look at it, but I feel it's like powerful.
He's absolutely spot on there. And again, it's one of the things I say in my talks, even if so many times at the end of my talk, people ask, Liz, I know I've got this friend, he's struggling, and I know he's going through something, but he will not open up to me. And I've tried everything, but he will not open up. We'll say, look, share one of your vulnerabilities. And even if you don't have any, or you think you don't have anyone, and I still believe nobody's got any vulnerabilities, but make something up and just say, oh, I'm really struggling at the minute with work. Can I have some advice? Because suddenly they look at you and again don't think you're superhuman, this indestructible individual. It's like if you're all sat in an exam and someone leaves the room and you don't know whether or not you put an X in the box or a tick, and someone goes, are I meant to tick the box or circle it? And everyone goes, oh my God, I don't know either. And I'm so glad you asked. Suddenly you're all in it together. And it's just being the brave person who puts your hand up above the parapet and kind of goes, I'm struggling a bit here. What are we supposed to be doing? Let's be honest, in life, none of us really know what we're supposed to be doing, but yet we all do this merry little dance and pretend that we do. And the sooner you can admit that you don't know what's going on and you might need a bit of a hand, the better.
Yeah, I always remember as a kid, like I never wanted to ask a question, like in class. Like I was like, nah, I must be the dumb one, like because you almost feel like a bit embarrassed, like you should know this, Gareth, sort of thing. And then the older I've like got, the more I've asked questions, and even if it seems like a dumb question, there's probably someone, at least one person, who's thinking the same thing, and like you said, they come up to you afterwards, they're like, oh, I'm glad you asked that, because I was thinking the same thing. You're like, okay, cool, maybe my questions weren't that dumb, or maybe I'm not that dumb, sort of thing.
And there's so many behaviors that we learn as kids that we don't even realize that impact us as adults. Very recently it was Men's World Mental Health Month back in June. And I put a post out about men's mental health because suicide is still the biggest killer in men between 35 and 55. And myself and a really good friend were chatting about it. And he said, whenever you're a small child, when you're a boy, if you fall and cut yourself and cry, the initial response from your parents is, boys don't cry. Come on, pat yourself down, boys don't cry. And it's such a throwaway line. But that's subliminal messaging for boys, is boys don't cry. Whereas little girls run and fall and cut themselves, generally they get swept up and like, oh, there, girl. Are you okay? Do you want a plaster? And there's a very different response to boys falling and girls falling and the tears that follow that event. from like age 2 or 3, and that is then chipped into your DNA forever going forward. And I always say, if you do run and fall and cut your knee, your body's response is to bleed. And whenever we see trauma or we experience something sad or a loss, I'd spent most of my career blocking in the tears and not letting them flow, which therefore had a very, very detrimental effect on me many years later. But we as humans are designed to cry, but we have somewhere along the line kind of tapped out of that and thought it's embarrassing, it's a sign of weakness, we shouldn't do it, we should apologize for it. My early career, I would stand very often on a stage, and when I was talking about some of the traumatic things from Afghan, picking up some of the injured or dead soldiers, I would cry. And I remember the early days, like apologizing, going, I'm so, so sorry. And very often that would be the standing ovation talks, funny enough, because I'm authentic and human on a stage. But I then caught myself on, and so basically started saying, look, I'm not going to apologize for crying, because this is a very normal response to what I'm talking about. And I get lots of people come up at the end of my talk now and they're in tears, and the first thing they always do is apologize. And I'm like, no, don't apologize. You're allowed to cry. So we, again, as a human species, need to get better at that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Liz, look, there's like I said, this conversation could have gone like a million different ways, right? And I'm so happy with the way it went. And like there's like some very dark parts, I guess, not dark, but like, things that have happened to you as a result of sort of trying to assimilate back into civilian life and all that sort of stuff. But you speak about that a hell of a lot, right? Obviously in your book, but also on other podcasts and stuff like that. So I just really want to encourage people to go and listen to those because, you're talking now, right? You're talking now in a very sort of confident, happy place because of what you've gone through, right? So you're speaking with a lot of experience, especially when it comes to mindset and say, I guess, motivation and like your understanding about people about depression and PTSD and trauma and all that stuff. So I really want to encourage people to go listen to other podcasts or read your book because, there's some heavy stuff in there. So it's worth them understanding where you're coming from on a lot of this. But we don't need to touch on that, right? Because you've gone there so many times. But I was just wondering if like people wanted to follow you, get in touch with you, what would kind of be the best way for that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn as Liz McConaghy, and I'm on Instagram as Liz McConaghy, but I also have a Chinook Crew Chick Instagram page, and I'm on Twitter, or X as we now call it, as Chinook Crew Chick, which is the title of the book. But the book's on Amazon. I think they do sell it. They do post to South Africa, but it's a hardback, paperback, and an audiobook as well, which I read. But you're right, there are some real strong life lessons, I think, in there. And, I absolutely broke and got to rock bottom and then pulled myself out of the dark. And that's a lesson for all of us. There is light after the dark. The darker the night, the better the sunrise is always a saying I use. And I think, hopefully I'm walking testament to that.
And what have you got coming up that you kind of most excited about?
So I say I'm a motivational speaker now, so I've got an incredible kind of year of gigs lined up here, there, and everywhere. I'm going back home to Belfast in October. I host the Belfast Veterans Awards every year, which is a really amazing event. And I've just started writing book number 2. So watch this space. That's hopefully going to come out. Who knows? But to see how long it takes me to write it. But my first book, it took me 3 weeks to write. So this one, the clock is ticking because I started it last week. So I might try and smash it out in a few weeks and then get it published. So yeah, you can see what happened next, maybe next year.
I can't believe you wrote a book in 3 weeks. That's crazy.
Yeah, it was a mental brain dump, really, and never intended anyone to ever read it. And then it got published. And I think that's why so many people connect with it, because it's not written with an agenda. It's just my life story, hoping that people don't repeat the same mistakes I did and get to the same point of failure where I got to. So yeah, hopefully people enjoy it.
And that's one of the cool things I think about, writing a book, where you said there's no agenda, and also doing it in 3 weeks. Like that just sort of oozes, I guess, authenticity, and people are really craving that these days. They're like, they want to connect with real people. And that's probably why, your book is such a success and your talks are, because they can feel it, they can feel when someone is being genuine.
Yeah. And the one thing I I think I realized very early on in my talks is that I can stand up there for the first half and tell everyone all about my time in Iraq and Afghanistan in the military. But it's the second half about mental health that connects with most people, because mental health, good and bad, connects us all on this planet. And, it goes up and down, it ebbs and flows. People have good years, good days, bad weeks. But, and for anyone who's walking along the planet thinking, well, I don't really have poor mental health, I've never struggled. I was that person until 5 years ago, and then I really struggled. So, I'm not suggesting for everyone to be worried that it's going to come your way at some point, but at least learn a little bit about it, so that when it does come your way, how to kind of get over it and how to get through it. So, yeah.
And my last question for you is, what does being ridiculously human mean to you?
Exactly what you just said, being authentic, not being scared to show your failures and show your vulnerability. That is the complete opposite of being ridiculously robotic, just letting the cracks show, because that's how you let the light out, and that's how you let the light back in again. So yeah, being authentic.
Cool. I like that. Let the crack show. That's a cool one.
Yeah.
Liz, I just wanted to say a massive thanks for coming on the podcast. Your story is incredible, right? And like I said, we didn't even go in any of those places because you've been there a lot of the times already. But you've lived just like a phenomenal life that makes people just go wow, especially if they get a chance to read your book. And just also thank you for like your service. I don't think people realize how much we have to thank for people that go to war, that serve us, in the military and the army and the navy, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, just wish you all the best with everything that you have coming up in the future and in your life.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That really means a lot. And yeah, it's nice to hear that. We always cringe a little bit when people thank us for our service, but it really does mean a lot. So I appreciate it.
No worries.